Okay, so I'm going to take an existing authentication app. So there's just authentication implemented in this. So let's see, this is JSON. So if I go to localhost 3000. Oh, actually, this thing is like. So it goes to the dashboard page. Okay, so let's look at some of the code. So phase 3, coding. Okay, so this code is not very well organized. There's just app.js and all the routes are in app.js. Let's do a little bit of refactoring. Actually, before doing that, let's just walk through some of the code. So you're using cookie parser, using express session. So express session is the package which is used to create and manage sessions, right? And it stores sessions on the server. When it's in development mode, all the sessions are stored on the server. And there is a cookie which gets created for each session, and the cookie contains the session ID, which is stored on the browser. So every time a request is made to the server, the cookie is sent from the browser to the server, and then the server looks at the cookie to figure out what is the session ID, and then finds the matching session in the session store. And in development mode, session store is in memory, which is why it's recommended that when you're in production, you use like a database-backed session store, which is you'll create a table in Postgres called sessions, and it has a column called session ID, and then a JSON column which contains the session. Why would you do this? Is because in development mode, when I restart my server, all the sessions are gone because the sessions are stored in memory. So you wouldn't want that to happen in production when every time you do a deploy, everybody's logged out, right? Which is why you want to have a persistent session store. So persistent session store is something that is stored forever, not forever, but like a longer period of time. Questions about that? Everyone with me so far? Cool. So using sessions, and then we have a middleware here. I don't know what it's really doing, so let's see. It's checking to see that we have cookies, and then we have a user ID cookie. And if we don't have a corresponding session for it, we clear the cookie. This is basically deleting cookies for stale sessions, which I think may not be necessary, but anyway. That is happening. And then we have the login page. So the login page, the get route is rendering this file, which we saw, which was an HTML file, which is like a form. And when the user posts to the file, we get the username and password from the request body because I sent it in the form. We try to find the username, right? So try to find the user using the username. If the user exists, if the user doesn't exist, we redirect them back to the login page, right? Otherwise, we check if the user is a valid user by checking the user that we found and comparing that user's password, because user's password is encrypted, right? So we need some sort of function that will encrypt the plain text password and compares it to the encrypted password of the user. So we'll see what this function does in a minute. So this function returns a true or false, right? Whether the passwords are correct or not. If the password is correct, if it's not correct, we again redirect to the login page. because the user entered a wrong password. Otherwise, we redirect to the dashboard page. Make sense?
What is capital user? Is that a constructor?
Actually, no. It's just the user thing. So actually, I should change this to small u. So let's do that.
Yeah, we just got four more people, so now we're bigger than 50.
Yeah, so let's just move it.
Okay. So that's the login page. Any questions about the login page? So now we have the sign up page, right? So the sign up page is very similar to the login page where we just render the sign up page. For the get request, for the post request, it's simple. We just create the user. So we are not actually checking here for whether the user exists or not. So that's something that we avoided, but feel free to add that in. So let's see how we would do that, right? Let's try to add that in. So here, we have, before we actually do a user.create, we should essentially check for user.find, right? So we first try to find the user. So user.find username. Then we get the user. Actually, you know what? I'm going to replace users with users. So no. Okay, so going back to that, so we first try to find the user, and then we get a user back, right? So if we do have a user, what do we want to do? Oh, bigger? Better? Okay, so what happens now? We have a user. What do we do with the user? Right, so we check to see if the user exists. So if there is a user, what do we do? Right, so or redirect back to the sign up page with a message saying user already exists. So we respond start
I just don't know how to do that.
/ sign up page. So we redirect back to the sign up page. So essentially, you may want to actually send back a message as well, right? Like some sort of a notification to the user saying, you know, our user already exists, or actually username, right? Something like that. But we don't have that functionality here where we're sending the flash message. But you can use like a package like, I think there's a package called Connect Flash, which you can use to show messages to the user. Okay, so we redirect back to the sign up page if the user has already signed up with that username. What happens in the else class?
Then you do what you were doing before. You create the user.
Right. So we create the user here. Right. So now we have some sort of validation to check if the user exists. Before we were just creating the user all the time. Everyone with me? Okay. So now we want to add like a layer of authorization. So who can tell me what authorization is?
Whether the user has access to certain aspects or areas of the app.
Uh-huh.
Permissions.
Permissions. Okay. So I like to think of authentication as like a way to get into like inside the room. But then inside the house. But once I'm in the house, I only have access to certain rooms in the house. Right? Like I need another level of permissions to go inside individual rooms. That's kind of how I like to compare authentication with authorization. Okay, so let's see what are the different pages we have here. So we have like 2 dashboard routes. It's weird. Right. Okay, so we have a dashboard route. Let's also create a new route called admin. Right, and I want to like say the admin page. I want to restrict this admin page, and I only want admins to go to this page. So how does this work? Oh yeah, I forgot about that. So I was being a little like lazy, and I didn't want to use a real database. So I created a fake database here. Just an object. Just an object which just contains the users and their passwords. So it isn't really storing it in a table. So all my functions are essentially like fake promise functions, which just mimic a database, which just return the object. Same thing with create. So when I create a user, I basically return this promise here. So I'm modifying the object, and I'm returning this promise, which is why from the control, like from the routes perspective, it just looks like it's a database because it's returning a promise, and I'm doing a .then. Very similar to what would happen if this was a real database function. So ignore this part. This is just me being fancy. But essentially, what I need to do is I need to add another column, right? Because I need a column now, which is a row. Right now, each user is going to have a role associated to them. So let's make me an admin, right? So I'm going to make myself an admin, and then I'm going to make Sound, who's my partner actually, her name is Sound. I'm going to make her maybe a regular user. So now we have 2 users, and let's make this oops. Interesting. Actually, I need to sign up because the password needs to be encrypted. So these 2 users are actually not valid. Okay, let me just delete these 2 users. So they just have 1 user. So it's a regular user, right? Notice that the password here is actually encrypted. I don't really know what the real password is. So what happens, this is actually the encrypted value of bar. The password is bar for this user foo, and the encrypted value looks like this. So when I log in, I can say foo and bar, and that logs me in, right? Even though my password is an encrypted value. So what it's doing, so remember we saw this function is valid password, which was in the login route. What it's doing is it's getting the user's password, right, which is a salted password, and it's doing a bcrypt compare on the password which is passed in with the salted password. Question, yeah.
On line 5, the password, you said that is bar?
Yeah, this is the encrypted value of bar.
Bar, okay. And is that going to be the same every time, or is that a change?
I think it's probably going to be the same every time.
So if I log in right now, bar is going to turn into that, but if I log out and log back in, it's going to be the same thing.
Yeah, because it uses the salt, right? So for a given salt, so where is the bcrypt? Yeah, so the salt rounds. Yeah, so the number of salt rounds, it's based on the number of salt rounds and the string, it always returns the same string. But I think there's a way to give it like a, maybe let's look at bcrypt. There's a way for bcrypt to accept an input salt, so that way it uses like this string and the number of times you want to salt it to, so that way it's not like a constant value. Because like if you have if you have an encrypted string and if I have an encrypted string, and if both those encrypted strings are the same, it doesn't necessarily mean it's the same password. It just means that I used a different mechanism to get to that point. So let's see. Okay, so there's gent salt, there's rounds. Right, so the salt, so you can also specify a salt. And the salt to be used to hash the password. Let's see. Right, so you creating a salt. So this gives you like a random string, and that's the initial value that it uses to start the encryption. So in our case, what's our salt? Where does the salt come from? Salted password. I see. So we can either provide a string or just a number. Okay. I see. So technique 2 auto generates a salt. So that's what we use. Where we're just providing the number of salt rounds, which is an integer. Whereas in the previous case, we were providing the actual salt, which is a random string, and that random string is used to encrypt and create an encrypted string. So think of it as like salt plus password gives you encrypted password, right? And salt plus, let's say salt plus a string foo gives you like an encrypted string, but you always want salt plus foo to give you the same encrypted string, because in the future you're going to have users who are going to be like logging in and they're going to be sending the plain text foo, and you have to compute the encrypted value, and then you compare that encrypted value to whatever is stored in the database. So for that to happen, the function should always generate the same encrypted string for the same input string, right? And how does it do that? Is because it has this initial string that it uses, and that's called the salt. So for the same salt, which is why a salt is supposed to be secret. You cannot leak the salt out to somebody. If you leak the salt out, you're completely hacked. So anybody can then use that salt and use bcrypt to hack your passwords. Yeah. Yeah, that could be in your .env.
You want to copy this into your
So we shouldn't just use the salt That's in the documentation.
It auto generates the solve.
Oh, okay, got it.
So whenever it generates a salt, how do you have, so you said you want to give it the same salt every time, right? Is that guaranteed by the get salt sync method that it always gives you the same salt?
Yeah, I think, yeah, I don't know how
So
that.
if it, like, always gives the same salt with the 10 salt rounds, but I did that on 2 different apps, and used 10 different salts.
That's a good question. You should try it out. Yeah, I would just like play around with it. I don't know the answer to that question. Yeah, but the thing to note is that you want to generate the same string, same encrypted string each time. Because if it generates different strings, then there's no way to kind of compare passwords, right? Okay. So now I have a role, right? So think of it as like I've added a column to my users table, and I've added a role here called, and the value is regular. So what I want is, so I have a dashboard page and I have an admin page. And the dashboard page is only accessible, rather a dashboard page is accessible by admins and regular users. But the admin page is only accessible by a role admin, right? So that's sort of the limitation I want to create. So how do I do that? Sorry, say that again.
Oh, like with the instant?
Right. So you need some sort of a conditional where you want to check what the current role of the user is, and then have some way to know whether there's access or not. So you don't want. So you also want it to be modular, right? So think of there's going to be many files where you'd want to be checking for this access. So you want that sort of, you want it to be a function that's easily accessible and can be called from any place, right? So I want to create essentially a module. So I'm going to create a file called authorization.js. Right, and I'm going to say module.exports is so I'm going to have a function here called has permissions.
Your export is 2x.
For that?
Your export is 2x for permissions.
Oh, I see. Thank you. Right, so this returns a boolean, and this takes in the user. And what else should this function take?
The role?
So the role is part of the user.
Oh.
Right? So user.role. The route, okay. Possible options are route. But then, so what is the route?
It's sort of like an address to a page.
Okay. So then, if I change the route, then what happens?
The permissions also change.
So then there's some sort of a coupling of the route to the permissions. I'd always think of like if I decide to change something, what is the implication of that change? Like how many files do I have to change them? So definitely one option is route. What else can we use? So what is the essence of a route? What is the user trying to do in a route?
Access.
Okay, access a page. And what does access a page mean?
Access a resource.
Access a resource, okay. So access here is the key word because access means that there's some sort of an action happening. So I think of like users trying to perform actions, right? And routes are just like a way to facilitate the action because that's how we HTTP. The only way to HTTP to do things is through a route, right? Through sending HTTP requests to and fro from the browser to the server. Right, but essentially what's happening under the hood is the user is trying to perform actions on pages, like creating a user, or like signing up, or actually both of them are the same thing, but like creating a contact, or like deleting their profile. Like these are actions that they're doing. The routes just happen to facilitate that action. Right, so the key is the action. So what we want to do is create a mapping of actions to permissions / roles, right? So which action or which roles have permissions to do the specified action, right? So what is a mapping? How do we create a mapping in code? An object, okay. So we can create an object, right? So we can say var permissions is an object. What's the object going to have?
Oh, right. So I beg your pardon. There's a step in the action.
So action and an array of like role 1 and role 2. Right? So something like action 1 can be done by role 1 and role 2, and action 2 can be only done by, let's say, role 2, something like this, right? So you kind of you're listing all the different actions that can occur and who are the roles that can perform those actions. So I'm going to call this actually actions to roles. So in our case, let's say view dashboard. Who can view the dashboard?
All you. So
I'm going to say regular users and the admins.
Yeah.
View admin dashboard. Who can do that? Just the admin. Right, so we're kind of coming up with different actions, and we're thinking of like who are the roles that can do those things. So then our permission has permissions function will take what? What is the second argument to the function? So the role is in the user. So let's actually just get the role out. So we have the role. What else do we need? The action. Right. So we need the role and the action.
What is an action?
This is the action.
When you're calling has permissions from that file, what is action?
So if I'm on the / dashboard page, what's the action going to be? View dashboard.
If it's get, are you going to type view dashboard as a string?
And then what I'm also going to have is some sort of sanity checks, right? So I'm going to have all possible roles listed in my system over here, and then I can say something like, whoops, what is that? If all roles that includes role, that means if the role is not in my list of all roles, I will throw a new error. Role right, so it's kind of like detecting errors with the data in my system. So if somehow somebody has a weird role that doesn't exist, then I'm going to like throw an error. Right? So if somebody tried to hack your system, so these are sort of like safeguards that you're adding into your system. So somebody tried to hack into your system and has changed their role to something else, you would want to know that. So then you throw errors when somebody has an invalid role. So that's a. What is the other else? The other safeguard. If it's an invalid role,
A page, like.
an invalid page, or an invalid action, right? So if right? So this is the second check, where I'm checking to see if the action is valid. And what's the last condition?
The user doesn't have permission into that table.
Or grant them access.
Right. So now, so what do we check? What are we checking? User doesn't have permissions.
Yeah.
So how do we do that?
Action to roles of action.
Action to role start action or off action. So let's say the role was, the action was view dashboard, right? So we're going to get back this array. So what do we do with that array? And what is this going to return? Okay, and then what do we do with that? Right? So let's try some tests. So has permissions, the role is admin, and the action is view dashboard. What should we get back? So I'm going to say node. So you get back true. Very good. So test 2. Actually, let's leave this here. Role is regular. What would we get back? Right, so we get back false. Let's do another one, which is test 3. Let's change this as super admin. What should we get back now?
Anywhere the role super admin does not exist.
I got that already inside of my.
Should have been.
Right. So this is
Okay, so we get that. Let's put some quotes around that. Right, so we get super admin does not exist. So let's try the fourth one, which is right, so what do we get now? This is the fourth one. So we got true, false. Oh, this is going to throw an error, so it's going to quit the program. So view admin does not exist. Right, so now we have like different tests and it's working for all edge cases. So I recommend always, like when you write stuff, always test your functions in with the different combinations of inputs to see how your program behaves. Okay, so now that we have this function, what are we going to do on the route side?
So we'll check if the user will use the has permission. We need to import the has permission functions.
Okay. So where are we? Source, so authorization. So now in our dashboard page, what would we do?
Has permission.
So hash permissions. So where's the user?
User being the session.
So request.session.user. So usually I like to hide the implementation details. So the fact that the user is on the session exposes the fact that we're using some sort of you're using express session, right? Because express session is the one that puts the user on the session object. So the simple way to do that is to just add a middleware. And what I would like to do is request.user equal to request.user.session. So this middleware is essentially putting the same user object just onto request.user. So then in my functions, I can just say request.user. I don't have to know anything about the session.
Wait, why is this better than?
Isn't it request session user? Or is that?
Oh yeah, sorry. You're right. So why is it better? Because request.session is something that is tied to express session. Right? If I was using a different library, this would change. Like I think if you're using like cookie session, I don't know what cookie session does, but it may do something different. So what you're doing is like you're hiding the implementation details of which library you're using and just making it a standard practice to like put it onto the request object. So no matter what session authentication you're using behind the scenes, I always expect request.user to have my user. So you're hiding the implementation details of the library that you're using. That's the intention. And this concept is just called an abstraction. So abstractions are things which hide details from people. Right, so like today when we are talking to the computer or working with code, we don't have to know how transistors work. Right, that's an abstraction. We just know that it works. Something is happening, but we know it's just working. So because it's so nice, it's a nice abstraction. Yeah, question?
Probably a dumb question, but
There's no such thing as a dumb question.
The app.js file, does that get run every time someone goes to a new route on a web page?
Does the file get run? What do you mean? Like, does it get evaluated?
Yeah, does it, or does it get pretty much run once they go to the web page for the first time, and then when they switch routes, other pages are run?
So the moment I do npm start, this is the first time that it evaluates the file.
Okay.
Right, so it's evaluating this file, and then it like looks and sees what are the different dependencies on this file. Anyway, ignore the error. It looks and sees what are the different dependencies and recursively evaluates each of those files. Right, so in my app.js, I have require express, require body parser. So it's going into express and evaluating express. It's going into body parser, evaluating body parser. So it's kind of nesting down until there's no more things to be required anymore.
And then it's been run and just kind of like has some sort of memory on the server.
Yeah, there's memory and it's holding all of the parsed files in memory.
And so if two different users go to your website, it keeps track of those different requests somewhere else.
So you're basically saying app.listen on port something, right? On this port. When that happens, it's essentially starting it's connecting the port to the server. So every request that comes into that port is going to be redirected to the server. So two users will go to the same, let's say go to dashboard and goes to admin. Those two requests are directed to the app. And app uses Express under the hood, which then keeps track of how to manage these different requests.
So it just makes a new version of the variable request. Every time you do go to a new route, it does make a new version of the variable.
Oh yeah, request. Yeah. Every request will have its own request response and next objects.
Okay.
So these functions are executed for every request.
They are?
Yeah.
Okay.
Right? Because every request has to perform its own thing.
Yeah.
So if I have dashboard and I have, or maybe dashboard is a contrived example, but let's say there was a request which was sum, and it took two parameters A and B. You send in a sum request with 10 and 20, and I have a sum request with 5 and 10. My result is going to be different. So I need to have my own request response in next object.
Okay. And then the request locals, you have to reset for every request.
Yeah, request locals are local for each request.
And then app locals apply to everybody.
Is global. Yeah. Cool. So what were we doing? So now that we have, so that's the abstraction thing I was saying, right? So now I don't have to worry about what I'm using. I'm just hoping request session is somehow available to me. Now that I have the user, what do I do? So what does has permissions take? It takes in a role and an action. So what do I need to send to has permissions? But actually, before even doing if, I'm just going to console log has permissions with user.role. What's the action here? View dashboard. So that's the only coupling that exists here. So now the coupling of the name of the action with the list of actions that you have here. Yeah.
Is this, I don't know, I mean, I'm a little uncomfortable using a string to ask for permission. Is this the standard way to do it?
So what is the uncomfortableness?
We're using a string literal, we're saying view dashboard, and depending on that, except for, I think what would be ideal, at least what I think would be ideal is to have some kind of, some request dot. Maybe the view dashboard was part of the request object.
But how will it get in there?
You'd have to use a middleware, right?
Okay, what would the middleware do?
You would check. Yeah, I'm sorry. I don't know.
So you want things to be a little automated. You're saying you're not comfortable with the fact that you're explicitly sending a string,
Right.
but you want something like request dot action or something.
Right.
But even to populate this, you either have to put it in as a string, or you're using something that's already in the request object. But that isn't any better, because now that value is hidden away. You don't know where it's coming from, or you have to dig a lot deeper to get to that value. And if you change things, it's not very obvious that it's changing. But I see your point. Like there should be a way to automatically, like if I change the URL here, that this thing is automatically reflected. But unfortunately, JavaScript is not. Or maybe the Express is not doesn't give us that that feature. Yeah, maybe there was a way to say something like, yeah, I don't know. But good point.
Could you maybe do it on like the request.url and check it that way, and then set up your actions tools to use the
you
URLs.
can, but then if you follow the RESTful convention, there's going to be the same URL for multiple routes, right? So for editing, not editing, but like showing, so get user/ID shows me the user's page, but a put user's ID updates the user. So the URL is the same, but because the method type is different, there's not going to be a mapping. You need a combination of URL and the method if you're going to be able to use as the URL. Yeah, so like I know, like in Ruby on Rails, for example, when I did web development before, there's Ruby on Rails has very good routing, so it gives you like functions for resources. For example, if you're trying to model the resource for, let's say, post, right? It gives you functions called posts URL. New post URL, edit post URL, view all post URL. Automatically it generates these functions. So because it generates those functions, if you change the URL, it automatically changes this function's return value. So you can use that function to map with the action. So in that case, what you're saying would potentially work. I don't know if that's, I don't think that's available in Express. So one of the disadvantages here is that there's this coupling, right? So now every time I change an action, right, I have to explicitly say view dashboard here. So let's say I decide that, oh, view dashboard is a horrible name, and I change this, I have to change it here, right? So let's say I say view dashboard safely or something. Then I have to change even this here. So there's a coupling. That's what Weber was saying. There's a bad practice. But we don't have anything better, so I'm going to go with that. Okay, so we're going to log what we get. Right. So now if I go to the dashboard page, it redirected me to the log. Okay, so I have the user there. Oh, wait a second. Something is broken. Let's see. Oh, I see. I didn't scroll next. Okay. So I get it true there. Right. So I try to log has permissions. So the has permissions for the role and view dashboard was true. Right. So now I can say if this. So if the permissions are true, then I render the page. Else, I render unauthorized, some sort of an unauthorized page. So let's say const.
is your NPM login already?
Yes.
You got NPM login done? Cool. And the terminal login. So in the terminal, you want to copy and paste that line and paste it on and then
So something like that. So if I change, nobody has permissions. So let's say even that the regular user does not have permissions to view the dashboard page. And I refresh, locks me out. Oh, sorry, not render. Send.
And you don't want to do your HLR, so you don't actually it is a persistent Yes.
Cool. So I get back an unauthorized. So all of this code is not organized at all. So I would suggest not following the convention of putting files in here. Do you want to spend some time refactoring? Because right now this file is this giant file, which I feel very uncomfortable leaving as is, because you're going to like then follow this as a standard to do it. So you want to spend some time refactoring? Yeah, yeah.
I have a question real fast. You saved like the sending unauthorized and a constant, and then you just called that. Would you, if you had like EJS set up, would you do that, or would you just like in the else just put res.status.render the page?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Good question. So did everyone understand this question? So usually in an app, you're going to use some sort of a templating engine, like EJS or Pug or something. And so in that case, I would have a page called unauthorized. I would have an unauthorized.ejs page, and then I could just say response.render unauthorized. So this would automatically render that EJS file. And also I just put a status. Instead of calling that function, I would do something like this. So if there was a templating engine being used. Yeah. Any questions so far? Okay, so let's do some hardcore refactoring. So if I look at the tree of my source, right, I don't have any routes in here, which is horrible. Right, I have everything in my app.js. So what I want to do is actually remove the IR routes. I'm going to say source. Okay, so now I have folder routes. So I'm going to touch server routes index.js. I'm going to touch.
Yeah, I'd be able to automatically install that for you. Where's
Okay, so let's start with these two. So in my index, okay, I'm also going to do server middlewares.js. So now my server file, server folder has a file called middleware, so I'm going to put all my custom middlewares. And then I have two files right now. Authentication, which is going to contain my login and logout routes. And index is just something that joins everything. And then actually now I also need one for sign up. So I'm going to create users.js. Okay, so let's move. So this is the login route. So I'm going to move this Actually, before that, I'm just going to go to my index route. Cool. So this is my index route. I'm going to like export my router. I'm going to require my router, and then I'm going to start by moving everything into this file. So right, so I'm going to move everything here just to like make things work. And then over here, I'm going to say var routes is require server routes. And then here, I'm going to say app.use slash routes. Alright, so that's my first step of refactoring, is just like add like not too much of a change. I'm just going to move everything here, so that way it's just transferring it and organizing it just at one level. So, question?
And then in the route, just to make sure your router you're going to change all the
Yeah, of course, yeah. So query replace app with router. Oops. Okay. And then I will need users. So I don't need users here anymore. Put it here. As permissions also doesn't need to be here. Okay. So things should just work. I shouldn't be getting any error anymore. But I cannot find server routes. So.
Oh,
Is it a router? Router versus routes?
no, shouldn't there be a slash in front of the server for some kind of?
Oh yeah, .slash. So DB user does not exist. So now here it would be one level back, 2 levels back. Same thing here. 1 level back. Okay, so it started. Things are still working. Nope, not working. So this dir name also changes. So So I'm in routes. Server.
So you not need a path to require.
Say that again.
The way I've been using dir name is I needed to require path. Do you not need that?
No, it's just available. It's just the current directory. So where am I? So I'm in source. So views is inside of source. So it exists. Okay, let's ignore it for now. We'll fix it later. Okay, so now that I have login and sign up in here, So the idea was that I have specific files for like the kinds of routes that I'm operating in. So all my login routes are going to go inside of my authentication jars. So I'm going to move my login inside my. I'm going to move that inside routes authentication. Same thing here. I need a router. And then I need users. And then I'm going to say module.exports. And then here I'm going to say router.use authentication. Oops. Right, so I'm just kind of replacing all these big functions and moving them into the respective files and just like replacing them with the call of the function call. So this one moves into users as well. Right, so here I would have router.use users. Same thing here.
Oh, on line 23. On 20,
Or 25, yeah.
sorry, user.
Thank you. Var users require users.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is move to. Question?
Do you want to export the header on your user shell?
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so now I'm going to move these middlewares. So think of these like these middleware definitions. They don't need to be in this file. Right, so I'm going to move this session checker into my middlewares, which is inside my server. Oops. So I'm going to say module.exports session checker. And then I'm going to require my middlewares. And then this just becomes middleware start session checker. Right, same thing with this one. So this function is, I'm going to create a function on the fly, which is add user to request. Right, that's essentially what the middleware was doing. So then I'm going to move that into a function, add user function, and then I'm going to say add user to request. Moved. And then this one too. So what is this doing? This is like middlewares, delete cookie for stale session. So now the code reads much clearer because now it's just the names of the functions, and the name of the functions are like documentation about what the function is doing. Right? So that was what is it? Delete cookies for state session. This can also be inside of the.
So the next thing you're going to do is
again, you can leave that here. So the dashboard page. Okay, rather the logout page can go inside authentication.
So you're going to create open another file.
So did we create a file for the dashboard page? We did not. I guess we could leave the dashboard page here. But like render unauthorized, for example, can go inside. That would create like a file called utils. So touch server utils.js, and this function could go in there. So utils. And then here I just require utils. So
everything that I posted with my shebang bash into a file. Oh, really?
So are you getting that sort of the hang of how to refactor, where you're moving things and organizing them? So now all of this just reads so like much clearly because you're just like looking at the calls of the functions as opposed to the function definitions. So you're moving the functions into the files where they belong.
And for the middleware, they don't have to be on the same file. You can also have like a middleware kind of folder.
Right, you can. So if you have like a crazy number of middlewares, then this will start to get a little crazy. So then you can start organizing your middleware. So instead of having a file called middlewares, you can convert this into a folder and then add like files grouping middlewares together based on kinds of middlewares. Good question.
And since you're having, since you have so many different middleware functions, do you still have to call route.use for each function individual? Or would there be like one?
I think it's much clearer to like call them individually because then you know what those middlewares are doing. And also, I don't think you can call all middlewares at once.
Okay.
You have to individually call them. Because the middlewares depend on the position in which they are. Because if I move this middleware to somewhere here, it's going to be a lot different behavior than if it was there. Because all these routes would be executed only after this function is executed. Right? So the order matters. So for example, a session checker, I don't want to check for the session for a login route because the user is never going to have a session before they've logged in. So you want the login route to be above the session checker. Whereas like all the routes behind authentication, you want that to be below the session checker. Does that make sense? Yeah, that's it. So I don't know why that thing's not working, but let's try to fix that. That's good.
Well, you haven't exported some of the functions.
Which ones? Which file?
Maybe the middlewares and
Am I getting any errors here? Let's see. No, I think it seems to be fine. I'm getting a forbidden page. So send is having a problem. I guess it was my authentication file, right? So this file.
Page, is it supposed to be random? Did you put?
So I don't have. I'm not using any templating engine, so I'm just directly using send file. Let's look at the documentation for send file. Express.js.
I spent like 3 days trying to figure out.
Okay, so send file takes a path, transfers the file at the given path. That's the content type.
I wasn't coordinating because we're talking a lot of different groups. I did my code in a lot of groups. It doesn't matter as long as it's the same kind of code. Okay, if you want to follow along in case override your
All right, so here you go. So the slash begins with a slash. And you can also use options.
I spent a lot of time. Like, you'll notice in my
Okay, let's try that. So their name. Always have to give a slash. Nope, it's still forbidden. Okay, anyway, I think this is like, you're not going to be using send file, you're going to be using a templating engine, so it doesn't really matter, but something, I'll try to investigate this to figure out what's happening. But essentially, you're going to try to like use some sort of a templating engine, so this would be like render, right? And this would be like something like login, or like. Also, like I like people to organize their view files, view folder. So just like how you have different file names for your different routes, similarly have corresponding folder names inside your views. So I would have a folder called authentication. I would have a folder calling users. So then all the corresponding view files for those functions would live in those folders. So it's easy to reason about where to find the view file for a corresponding route. Does that make sense? So I would potentially do mkdir views authentication, and then views users. And then if I go to views, let's remove login and sign up. And then I would say authentication login dot, let's say EJS. And then right, so then if I do this, it looks like this.
Folder name /
Right. So then in my render here, I would have authentication / login. Any final thoughts, questions? Cool. Thank you all.
Awesome.